So I've used the word genre now several times, and the root of genre is the same root that we come up with for gender. So it's a word meaning the type is all it is. And as I said before, the characteristics of a genre are not absolute. There's no one thing that absolutely 100% defines a genre. It's always up for debate. But there are some general ideas, and a lot of these that stem from Aristotle's Poetics. So a tragedy, in its purest sense, as in the way they were originally done back in Greece, a tragedy must contain a serious subject. The protagonist, who is the lead character, must be a great figure of heroic proportions. So he must be a king or a prince or somebody big, a general perhaps, somebody not just a normal person. But as this larger than life heroic figure, he must represent something in a lot more people, something that the audience can identify with. It should be noted that modern tragedies, the protagonist does not have to be a big hero. In a modern tragedy, the protagonist can be just an ordinary person. As in Death of a Salesman, which is one of the probably greatest thought of modern tragedies, the protagonist is a salesman, just a salesman. So in a tragedy, everything that happens in the tragedy must happen honestly, with no element of chance. So what has to happen happens, and it happens absolutely. This causes this, which causes this, which causes this. There's no sudden thing that happens and changes the direction of everything. And then also in a tragedy in its purest sense, the protagonist must be defeated, usually by death, but out of this defeat comes enlightenment. So back at the top, when I said that the protagonist must represent more than one individual, the audience must be able to identify with this protagonist. When the protagonist is defeated, there has to come some kind of enlightenment that happens to the audience because they could identify with this protagonist. According to Aristotle, this creates catharsis, so this enlightenment. And during catharsis, the audience gets to purge emotions of pity and terror. So they go through an emotional change because of the downfall of the protagonist who they identified with. And some examples of tragic heroes then are Oedipus, Creon from Antigone, Hamlet and King Lear in Shakespeare's tragedies, and then Willy Loman, who I mentioned, which is from Death of a Salesman. So comedy in its purest sense, as in the way Aristotle would have put it, the play treats its subject in a lighter vein, although the subject may be a serious one. And a comedy provokes thoughtful laughter. And this has changed a little bit over time. Nowadays, when we think of comedies, we frequently think of things that are more like a farce or slapstick or something that doesn't create or provoke thoughtful laughter. Matter of fact, a lot of comedies we think of, there's no thought involved whatsoever. But traditionally, in the purest sense of the word, a comedy should provoke thoughtful laughter. The events in a comedy should be possible and probable. So, yes, it might be a little implausible, maybe a little bit, but it is possible that things that are happening could have happened. And it, probably should have happened that way, given the rules of that particular comedy. In a comedy, the plot grows out of the characters rather than the situation. You've heard of the term sitcom, situation comedy. Well, that is comedy that's based on the situation the characters find themselves in, not based on the characters themselves. And this is another thing that is different than the way we think of comedy today, but the story in a traditional Greek kind of comedy is an honest portrayal of life. Comedy has many subgenres that don't even come close to following those 5 points. As an art form, comedy doesn't have the same historical reputation as tragedy. People who write serious drama have always been considered higher artists than people who write great comedies. I don't believe that to be the case at all. I think it's actually probably harder to write a brilliant comedy than it is to write a good, solid piece of drama. But that's just me. One thing that happens with comedies, though, is quite often a comedy is written for a particular time and place, the way the society is when the moment the play is written. And so most comedies lose their popularity faster than most tragedies do. Now there are some exceptions to that, and the French playwright Molière has written plays that have survived through the ages, and Shakespeare has written comedies that have survived through the ages, and there are some Greek comedies that have actually survived through the ages. I'll mention one in a little bit. Aristotle wrote that the original comedies evolved from improvised entertainments and bawdy sketches. Bawdy sketches are something that's very popular on Saturday Night Live. The kind of comedy that Saturday Night Live is providing is also the kind of a type of comedy that was around 2,500 years ago, which again to me is really quite odd. The bawdy sketches, and bawdy, in case you don't know the word, means, a little sort of, dirty or sexual or something a little lowbrow about them. Shortly after the Greeks, and we'll get into this more when we study the history part, the first things that were produced in ancient Greece were tragedies, followed by comedies, and then a little while later there were plays called satyr or satyr plays, and those were extremely, extremely bawdy comedies. And I have the feeling that when Aristotle was writing about how comedy evolved from improvised entertainments, they were talking more about the satyr type of plays than they were about the comedy type of plays. But I wasn't alive when Aristotle was. I didn't get to ask him. Aristophanes, who was one of the great Greek comic playwrights, and we will talk about the tragic playwrights again later on in the class, but he wrote a play that it's still produced quite often today, called Lysistrata, and it was an anti-war comedy. You can probably guess from the poster that basically what happens in the play is the women are tired of the men going off the war, and so they decide that they will not have sex with the men any longer until they stop going to war. And so they have a strike, a no sex strike. And it's actually kind of funny that one of the conceits in the play is that it's just as hard for the women to not have sex as it is for the men to not have sex. And it's really just one or two women standing in the middle of the two that manage to make the strike actually work. So then another comedy that's lasted throughout time is Shakespeare's comedies, A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is produced all the time. There was a very famous movie of it made, 20 years ago now, with a lot of people who you would recognize, and maybe I'll get a link up for that later on.